The world is thought to be experiencing one of the most extreme, long-lasting and widespread heatwave and drought events we've ever seen.
Now, a new study says that catastrophic climate change outcomes, including human extinction, are not being taken seriously enough.
Climate scientists say the recently signed Inflation Reduction Act could help reduce global warming. The historic climate bill, which was signed into law Tuesday, commits nearly $400 billion to help fight climate change.
Nations of the world, the more powerful nations of the world, simply ignored these problems. We say, oh, it's nothing to do with us because our arms. We caused it.
For more on the climate crisis, John Muir Memorial Chair of Geography and founding director of the Water Resources Group, Glenn McDonald. Glenn, scientists say that climate change is making these heat waves more frequent, causing things like droughts and wildfires. Just how concerned should Americans be about the climate crisis right now?
For 2.5 million years, the Earth's climate has fluctuated, cycling from ice ages to warmer periods. But in the last century, the planet's temperature has risen unusually fast, about 1.2 to 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Scientists believe it's human activity that's driving the temperatures up, a process known as global warming. Ever since the Industrial Revolution began, factories, power plants, and eventually cars have burned fossil fuels such as oil and coal, releasing huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases trap heat near the Earth through a naturally occurring process called the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect begins with the sun and the energy it radiates to the Earth. The Earth and the atmosphere absorb some of this energy, while the rest is radiated back into space. Naturally occurring gases in the atmosphere trap some of this energy and reflect it back, warming the Earth. Scientists now believe that the greenhouse effect is being intensified by the extra greenhouse gases that humans have released. Evidence for global warming includes a recent string of very warm years. Scientists report that 1998 was the warmest year in measured history, with 2005 coming in second. Meanwhile, readings taken from ice cores show that the greenhouse gases carbon dioxide and methane have hit their highest levels in the past 420,000 years. Arctic sea ice is also shrinking. According to NASA studies, the extent of Arctic sea ice has declined about 10% in the last 30 years. As long as industrialized nations consume energy, and developing countries increase their fossil fuel consumption, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will continue to rise. Researchers predict that temperatures will increase about 2 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. What's less certain is what rising temperatures mean for the planet. Some climate models predict subtle changes. Others forecast rising sea levels which could flood coastal areas around the world. Weather patterns could change, making hurricanes more frequent. Severe droughts could become more common in warm areas, and species unable to adapt to the changing conditions would face extinction. Although much remains to be learned about global warming.
A brutal heat wave has hit Pakistan, with daily temperatures hitting more than 50 degrees Celsius. Pakistan has now turned out to be one of the hottest countries on the planet.
On to China now, which has issued its first national drought alert of this year as the country battles scorching temperatures and a heat wave across the basin of China's Yangtze River basin. The national yellow alert coming after regions from Sichuan in the southwest to Shanghai in the Yangtze Delta experienced weeks of extreme heat. The yellow alert is 2 notches short of the most serious warning on Beijing's 4-tier color-coded weather warning system.
Australia now aims to source more than 80% of its electricity from renewable energy by 2030.
First, the European Union has today unveiled new legislation aimed at helping the bloc to meet its commitments for the cutting of greenhouse gas emissions by 55% during the course of the next decade. Well, the legislation, which took effect in 2016, includes around a dozen major initiatives, amongst them tougher caps on car pollution, as well as limits on pollution from buildings. Well, foreign companies will also have to face duties for the pollution that they create.
In 2019, millions of climate change activists took to the streets. Their figurehead, Greta Thunberg, addressed the US Congress.
I don't want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to the scientists.
Here's the thing. American politicians have been hearing from scientists about the threat of climate change since the 1980s.
This evidence represents a very strong case, in my opinion, that the greenhouse effect has been detected and it is changing our climate now.
3 decades on from James Hansen's testimony, climate change is now recognised as the defining threat facing the planet. So why has so little been done to stop it? "50 years ago, environmentalism was a fringe topic. But within a few years in the late 1980s, climate change quickly rose up the political agenda.
We have begun to fight an important battle.
We must also expect environmental responsibility.
140 species are becoming extinct every day.
At Rio, we have made a start.
This is an incredibly fast bit of worldwide discussion and diplomacy. It's hard to think of something else other than a war that went that quickly.
But turning this gathering interest into decisive action was another matter. In 1997, UN members met in Kyoto to agree for the first time on specific cuts to greenhouse gas emissions.
I am instructing increased negotiating flexibility.
But there was a catch.
The Kyoto Protocol put various constraints on industrialized economies to cut their emissions. It put no constraints on developing countries on the basis that at that point, the vast majority of emissions had come from industrialized countries.
Its origin in the UN gave the Kyoto Protocol universal legitimacy. But designing a treaty that all countries could accept meant producing one with very little practical power.
The UN has this fundamental issue that it's a creature of its members. UN organisations lack clout. They can't just tell their member countries what to do.
This wouldn't have mattered if every country shared the same urgent need for action. But they didn't. A sound environmental policy is likely to benefit everyone, but the costs fall on particular groups, typically those that do most of the polluting. And it's these groups that have a strong interest in avoiding these costs.
Most of the beneficiaries of climate action are people who don't yet exist, or certainly can't yet vote. And so aligning the general interests of that mass of humanity with the specific interests who are genuinely harmed by reducing fossil fuel emissions, that's a hard thing to do. It would be a hard thing to do within one political body. But if you have to do it between lots of nations, that's even harder.
America, a country which relies heavily on fossil fuels like petrol, coal, and natural gas, refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol.
The use of fossil fuels has completely exploded, and it's impossible to disentangle that explosion from the huge growth in human population and in human wealth that took place at the same time. So still, about 80% of the energy used on the planet is dug up from the ground.
Fossil fuels were formed from the remains of organisms that lived and died millions of years ago. They hold a lot of carbon within them, making them a very concentrated store of energy, which helps to explain the political power of the companies that extract and distribute them.
You mentioned in one of your last talks that petroleum wasn't what we thought it was, that it wasn't a fossil fuel, that it didn't come from fossil animal.
Yeah.
Is it just a mineral? Is it a mineral like any other mineral? Is that how it what would you say? What's the origin of
You see,
petroleum?
when they first found petroleum, because they were beginning to make motors and needed on axles of wheels on railroad trains and all that sort of thing, and remember trains started in the beginning of the 19th century, then oil went from just a lubricant to a fuel, and it made it valuable. And Rockefeller happened to be the smartest man in the business at the time, but he made most of his money, or much of it, off the transport of the petroleum as well as selling it. But one thing they realized was, because oil is putting a price on oil is like putting a price on a pail of water. You know, no initial cost. It's in the ground, and in those days they were, some of it almost what you'd call surface mining the oil. They didn't go down deep. So in order to get the price up, they hit on the idea that they would have to make it appear to be scarce. That boy, after we take the next few barrels out, we're probably going to have to close as well. You know, that kind of thing. Well, a very fortuitous event. In 1892, there was a convention in Geneva of scientists to determine what organic substances are. Well, the definition of organic is a substance with hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. And so it's usually a living substance, a tree. You analyze a dead tree, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, and grass, and so on, living things. Animals, we are hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. So at this Geneva Convention, Rockefeller took advantage of sending some scientists over who said, oil, petroleum, is hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. Therefore, it must be derived from the spoiling, the rotting of formerly living matter. And playing the game properly, when this scientific convention was over, they defined oil as the residue from formerly living matter. Well, that makes it a fossil fuel. I don't know why they decided to use the word fossil, but it says formerly living matter, it's fossil. Well, of course, today, and another thing we should know is that there has never been a fossil, a real fossil, found below 16,000 feet. And you can't argue at 16,000 as a level line because someplace the ground sinks and so on, but 16 is what the scientists say, 16,000. We mine oil, or we drill for oil, at 30,000, 33,000, 28,000 every day of the week. So right there we rule it out that it isn't fossil fuel. It's called fossil fuel for the minds of the public to feel that it is an asset that is running out, being depleted. We talk about depletion allowance, which is a lot of, you know, and actually if you know the world's oil supply, you know that it is not going to run out for an awfully long time. It is the second most prevalent liquid on Earth. And we haven't begun to dig. Well, with all that background, you see, the people in charge of the petroleum business, for perfectly reasonable business things, just like any other man in a business, wants to keep his price as high as he can get away with. And the way to do is just say, well, there's no more. The last barrel is going to cost $1,000, and then it's all done. And they preach that stuff. What bothers me is that in geology books, it's in there. The geologists say it's a fossil fuel. Somehow they've been bought. I mean, I went to a 4-year federal staff energy seminar run by the government of the United States during the so-called energy crisis. I was the participant that represented the railroad industry. The airline industry was there. Every AA, administrative assistant of senators and congressmen, was there. The CIA was there, the Defense Department was there, the State Department was there. Sometimes sitting right in front of me in the row would be Henry Kissinger with his friend, the head of Department of Defense. It's too bad I can't put the names with them. But anyway, people like that, top men in the government, sitting there listening to the Federal Staff Energy Seminar. Well, what this was doing is for 4 years, they were teaching a propaganda line to the leading people in this country, and therefore to the leading people in the world, when you include the Schlesingers, Kissinger and Schlesinger, among others. And the object of it was, as Kissinger used in his own terms when it was time for him to speak, to create a world price for oil. In other words, not 30 cents a gallon here and 90 cents a gallon there, but let's get a world price. That's their goal, and they're trying to do that for wheat and everything else.
The tar sands of Alberta alone contain enough hydrocarbon to fuel the entire planet for over 100 years.
What's he talking about? This is what the Canadian tar sands looks like. It's a Florida-sized patch of this disgusting stuff. Sand and rock mixed with oil. Lots of it.
We're talking trillions of barrels, the whole planet, from Alberta for about a century.
Peter Huber, co-author of The Bottomless Well, says people think we're running out of oil because we're running out of cheap oil, the kind that's found in the Middle East, already liquid, clean, and ready to refine.
It's very cheap to get that oil out of the ground, so of course that's where people go first.
They can pull it out of the ground for $5 a barrel.
Less.
It costs 3 times as much to get oil out of these tar sands because they have to add hot water to the sand to separate the oil. But now that oil's expensive and likely to stay that way, companies find it profitable to do this. Clive Mather, who runs Shell in Canada, says the Earth's supply of hydrocarbons is almost infinite.
And those are not running out. In fact, we've hardly started to develop them.
The planet contains huge amounts of buried hydrocarbons. The question is, can you get them out? At what price?
But so why are we hearing all this stuff about running out?
It's nothing new. People have been saying this for 150 years.
They sure have. So-called experts say things like, we're going to become a dying civilization. We will see the extinction of Homo sapiens.
People are always saying that about it can be Ebola, it can be flu, global warming. Sometimes they're right, usually they're wrong, and they've been saying it about oil for a long time.
They sure have, and joining us now from Washington is Peter Huber, co-author of The Bottomless Well, The Twilight of Fuel, The Virtue of Waste, and Why We Will Never Run Out of Oil. So, Peter, with that title, how come we keep having oil when all the experts say it's going to be gone by now?
Well, the planet is bigger than a lot of people believe, I guess. You know, we're accustomed to these pictures from outer space and this tiny little jewel of a planet. It looks like a teardrop out there. But it's a very big planet, and we've barely begun to scratch the surface.
But it is a finite resource.
Sure. And the fun is a finite resource as well. You know, the solar system is a finite resource, but we're not about to collide with the limits. So, you know, if we're quibbling about definitional things, finite versus infinite, sure, it's finite. The sun is finite too. Are we worried about running out of solar energy anytime soon?
No, but you talk about Alberta, Canada maybe providing enough energy for the next 100 years. Then what?
Look, 100 years from now, the one thing I'm sure of is that things will be very different from how they are today. The planet has a lot beyond buried hydrocarbons. We have huge amounts of nuclear fuel. There are gigantic, huge amounts of frozen gases, the hydrates just off the coast of most continents. I mean, enormous supplies. Ask me 1,000 years, I'm even less sure of what the technology will be doing, but I'm quite sure we won't be driving sort of 19 or 2006 SUVs 100 years from now or 1,000.
So in terms of oil, the issue is really just price. And at these high prices, it's profitable to suck it out of all kinds of new places.
Well, it's price, it's technology, there are environmental concerns, there are political concerns. Saudi Arabia can pump oil today for well under $5 a barrel. That's about a dime a gallon, what they're just pumping crude out. Is that the only cost involved? No, of course not. You have to have refineries. If a hurricane sweeps through our refinery area on the Gulf Coast, that's an issue. If war breaks out in the Mideast, that's an issue. If somebody begins tossing nukes around the Mideast, that'll be a very big issue. Forget $100 oil. We could see $500 oil if things get bad enough. But is the planet going to put a stop to this? No, not in our lifetimes, not in our grandchildren's lifetime.
This is a brief video on the abiogenic theory of the origin of oil and natural gas. In a nutshell, the abiogenic theory is that most oil, petroleum, natural gas, what we often call fossil fuels, are actually derived from primarily methane, which was trapped in the Earth when the planetary nebula condensed. So the mainstream Western theory of the origin of oil and natural gas is that when the nebula formed, it did contain methane, but it became the early Earth and other planets became extremely hot, and the methane burned, essentially oxidized to water and carbon dioxide primarily. And then in turn, that eventually gave us the atmosphere that we have, gave us life, and then living organisms produced oil and natural gas. They were trapped in sedimentary rock and sort of pressure cooked over millions of years into mostly oil and natural gas that we have. That's the source of gasoline, diesel fuel, heating fuel. That's all over the Middle East and Southern California and other places. However, there's been for a long time a theory that in fact the oil and natural gas formed from this methane, which then polymerized into more complex hydrocarbons that make up heavier materials, coal, oil, natural gas, etc. That theory is very closely associated with the late physicist, Thomas Gold. So Thomas Gold died in 2004, but he really championed and popularized this idea in the United States. He was very out of step with sort of the mainstream scientific theory, and late in his life he published a book kind of summarizing his theories about this called The Deep Hot Biosphere, The Myth of Fossil Fuels, which I've read. And he not only postulates that the Earth is full of hydrocarbons from the planetary nebula, not from fossil fuels, but in fact that these are oxidizing within the Earth and produce the heat inside of the Earth. So it's not coming from uranium trapped in the Earth, which is the mainstream theory, but there's actually chemical combustion at a low level going on deep inside the Earth, and that's why the interior of the Earth is hot, and also that in fact living organisms probably originated in this subterranean hydrocarbons that were there from the very beginning of the Earth. And so expects, and indeed we do find bacteria actually living in oil fields and so on. One thing that's important to understand is generally it used to be the case that you would be taught that oil and natural gas came from plants and animals which had been pressure cooked. I remember that in school when I was a kid, but that's clearly false. The oil and natural gas, for the most part, that we find, and there is an exception I'll talk about in a minute, but it is full of chemicals called halpanides that come from bacteria. In fact, there's very little evidence, very little of the chemicals you would expect to see if plants and animals produced oil and natural gas. So the dominant theory today, the mainstream Western theory of the origin of oil and natural gas, is that bacteria, small single-celled organisms, were trapped in sedimentary rock hundreds of millions of years ago, and by some process we can't really duplicate in the lab, pressure cooked into oil and natural gas and coal and so on. The alternative theory has an implication. One of a number of implications of it would be that planets like Mars, the Moon, many bodies in the solar system actually must contain hydrocarbons as well inside of them, and that would naturally lead to the expectation that you'd get methane, which is the main hydrocarbon we're talking about, seeping to the surface of Mars, which of course is something we may be observing. So the Curiosity rover on Mars has been detecting methane intermittently for several years. Just made the news yet again with a particularly high amount of methane. It's not really that much, it's parts per billion, but it was totally unexpected, at least by mainstream scientists. Again, if you believe in the deep hot biosphere and the ideas of Thomas Gold, you would expect to see this. It's likely that this would happen. And Mars would be a very good place to look for this type of methane, or verify this theory. Now, there are many other ways that there could be methane on Mars. It could come from Mars could have supported bacterial life, could still have bacterial life, and that was pressure cooked into methane, or in fact there are living organisms underground, or even some geological processes that have nothing to do with life that might produce methane. But the major point is this theory, which this is a good book on it. This is Thomas Cole's Deep Hot Biosphere, and it's a sort of semi-popular book. It's not very technical. It explains his theory, and he makes a lot of strong arguments in the book that, in fact, most of the oil and natural gas, coal, etc., that we're dealing with on Earth, that we find on Earth, is in fact of abiogenic origin. So he makes a good case for that. Is there really contrary evidence to what he presents? So he presents a number of fascinating things. There are actually a fair number of major oil and natural gas discoveries in non-sedimentary rock. In other words, no one would have expected them to have oil and natural gas, but they do. That's been known for a long time. There are a lot of those in the former Soviet Union because they don't actually, many people in the former Soviet Union don't believe the fossil fuel theory. But there are ones in the West as well. And so the point of this is that there is actually a lot of evidence for it, but the question you might ask is, well, is there contrary evidence? And yeah, in his book, Gold concedes that lignite, which is a type of coal, is almost certainly formed from naturally compressing peat, which is actually plants. This is not bacteria, and lignite is mined all over the place, and there's a lot of evidence, and keep in mind, Gold is very gung-ho his own theory. There's a lot of evidence that lignite in particular is actually produced by a biological process that is actually basically plants, not bacteria, that have been pressure cooked. It's worth noting it's one of the few examples where the evidence supports that the coal, if you will, is coming from plants or animals. The vast majority of oil fields that we've gone down into actually don't have plant material. They don't have plant chemicals from the membranes, from the constituents of plants. What they do have are chemicals called hopanoids and some other chemicals that are characteristic of bacteria, which was a surprise, but it's now the mainstream theory that most of the oil and natural gas on Earth is coming from bacteria that were trapped in sedimentary rocks over time. That, in a nutshell, is the abiogenic theory of the origin of oil and natural gas. And if you want to find out a lot more about it, probably there are a lot of online sources and so on, but you probably should go to Deep Hot Biosphere, get a copy of it, or check it out if you're a library, if you have access to a good library. But there's a lot of work that's been done on this theory, and I can't do justice to it in a short video. This video was produced on Monday, June 24th, 2019.
Yeah, if the UK is going to meet its net zero target, then the vast oil and gas industry out there in the North Sea is going to have to play its part. And the government wants that industry, the UK government, to be on board. But what if the chief exec of an oil company has serious doubts, not just about the science behind climate change, but the scale of the problem? This is our exclusive report. The North Sea, home to one of the UK's great challenges on the path to net zero by 2050. Millions of barrels of oil and gas are extracted from beneath these waters each week. And the UK government now wants the industry's help to reach its climate goals. But tonight we reveal one of the oil executives involved in that mission believes, in his own words, that the climate emergency is fake. New research from climate journalists DSMOG and the think tank Commonwealth, shared exclusively with Channel 4 News, shows how big household names in fossil fuel like BP, Shell, Total have been selling off many North Sea oil and gas licenses, allowing smaller, more obscure companies to emerge, including one called Orcadian Energy. Now, Orcadian Energy is a relatively new player in the North Sea, but it holds the licenses for huge reserves out there. And a further investigation by this programme has discovered that its chief executive is an unlikely partner in the drive to net zero. Not least because he said recently that the drive to net zero is insane.
Dan, you got the money, okay? I got a few, Bob, yeah. Okay, you support Trump? You do?
Yep.
Okay.
I was one of the first endorsers, public endorsers of President Trump.
What are you guys going to do when our ocean level rises?
Thank you for asking that question. I have the answer.
No, let me finish.
I have the answer.
Let me finish.
Thank you for the question. Yeah. Okay.
For the first time on Earth, we're changing the gas
Now you're full of shit. Sit down. I'm going to answer you. I'm going to just shut up and sit down.
No way.
Sit down.
No, I got to finish my question.
I'm going to answer global warming.
All right, finish the question, then answer.
It's changing on Earth, and it's changing to CO2. What do you people with the money, what are you doing about this? Because
I'm going to tell you right now.
No, I've got children. I've got 21, 23-year-old children. And what's their future with you people with money? You talk about money all of the time.
Okay, sit down, please. Sit down, please. In the front row. Excuse me. In the front row. Please sit down. Okay, you've asked your question. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm gonna answer.
Excuse me, ma'am. Will you please sit down? Please.
Thank you.
That's okay. Please sit down. Let him answer.
Okay. In 2011, my wife and I were in Antarctica, renewing our vows. For most of you that don't know, Antarctica's on a mountaintop. Okay? And there is a $500 million facility, scientific facility there, and the scientists came to give us presentations about global warming. And they had cores of ice that they had drilled. They had drilled 4,000 or 5,000 cores, and they only brought 15 or 20. So they're going through the second or third core, and they said 275,000 years ago, this was the temperature, blah, 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 blah. And then 55,000 years ago, the world was 2 degrees warmer Celsius than it is today. This is 2011. And, wait, stop. And he said, and I said, well, you mean the whole world? He says, yes. And the poles are only benchmarks. And I said, well, what about the things that the young woman alluded to? Okay? And he said, it's all cyclical. And although the gas may have exacerbated it, in the cosmos of time, it's not a fart in the wind. In the cosmos of time, of the 13.8 billion years that we've been on this miserable planet, it's not a fart in the wind. And as I told Joe Rogan on his show, and he said in his infinite wisdom, and Joe, if you hear this, I thank you for the opportunity to be on your show. He said, then in 25,000 years, it's most likely not going to be a problem. Now, my direct answer to your question, if that were really true, which you believe, and let's just for a moment say that it is true, that means that the best scenario vis-a-vis global warming is about 10 feet raise in water. That's the best scenario over the next 40, 50 years. That's the best scenario. The worst scenario is about 100 feet. But let's just take the 10 feet. If the water on the planet is going to rise up 10 feet, that means the southern part of the United States is gone. England is gone. Most of Europe is gone. And I can go, most of Central America is gone. Okay. If that's the case, let's just take Florida, for example, which is one of the fastest growing beachfront condominiums on the planet. In the prospectus, when you invest, there should be, in the footnotes, if global warming is for real, they won't put it that way, global warming happens and water rises 10 feet, this investment you made is fuck all. Not one single investment prospectus written since 2000, this century, has alluded to global warming. Not one motherfucker. If it were really true, the banks wouldn't invest. The banks wouldn't finance. Not one motherfucking condominium. So the people that have the money, and I'm jealous of the Vice President, Gore, which Sally and I rode on a plane from South America with a few years ago. I am jealous he came up with a scam before I did. Because the financial institutions, the banks of this world know it's not going to happen. Otherwise, you couldn't get a goddamn loan in London. You know those 30, 40-year mortgages? The world will be over by then. Is Barclays Bank going to give you a motherfucking loan? With the greatest respect, ma'am, it's the greatest fraud that's been perpetrated on mankind this century.
Amidst the chaos, negotiations, and counter-protests surrounding COP26 in early November, arose promises to be better in terms of emissions and environmental destruction. Hundreds of countries pledged to halt deforestation by 2030, while leaders across the world vowed to reach net zero emissions targets by certain dates. In the case of India, Prime Minister Modi shocked the gathered negotiators with an ambitious pledge to achieve net zero emissions by 2070, while the United Kingdom has championed a net zero by 2050 plan. The list of net zero targets goes on, but there's a problem. Net zero emissions can mean vastly different scenarios depending on the context. Theoretically, India, the UK, or even fossil fuel companies that set net zero emission targets can continue spewing out greenhouse gases under the claim that future carbon capture technologies will make up for all of their emissions. So today we unpack the implications of net zero pledges, what they mean, whether they're effective tools, and whether they might actually be doing more harm than good. This video is sponsored by CuriosityStream, which now comes with Nebula for free when you sign up using the link in the description. A decade ago, an idea was brewing, one that was meant to encapsulate the dual task of simultaneously reducing emissions and capturing greenhouse gases out of the air. The concept of net zero climate targets took root quickly during the Paris climate negotiations. Net zero became the new climate buzz phrase for political and corporate leaders alike. In theory, a net zero strategy is a promising development. When approached correctly, Professor of Economics Matthew Potts and PhD candidate Oliver Miltenberger write that for a country or corporation to achieve net zero emissions, it must identify and report all emissions it is responsible for creating. It then reduces them as much as possible, and then if it still has emissions it cannot reduce, it invests in projects that either prevent emissions elsewhere or pull carbon out of the air to reach a quote-unquote net zero balance on paper. In short, the ideal path towards a net zero target must foreground emissions reductions. And then when all options for reductions are exhausted, carbon sequestration techniques can be used as a last resort. The problem with net zero goals, however, is that there is no standard. One company may not even reduce its emissions at all and rely on future carbon capture technologies, while a country might heavily reduce greenhouse gas output and only supplement with carbon negative options at the way end. In most cases, however, net zero climate targets are just a buzz phrase for procrastinating until the very last second. Or in the words of the satirical government ad by the YouTube channel The Juice Media,
net zero by 2050 means that instead of being honest this decade by taking this path, we leave the being honest part to the last minute by taking that path instead.
Because net zero can mean so many things, countries and corporations use these targets to continue polluting and turning a profit on the bet that some massive carbon capture infrastructure will suck up their emissions at the 11th hour. Net zero is yet another procrastination tactic, plain and simple. And who better but oil and gas giant BP to show us why net zero is a scam? In February of 2020, as COVID-19 began to shake the world, the CEO of BP stepped up onto a podium surrounded by press and announced something seemingly monumental. The fossil fuel giant BP would achieve net zero emissions by 2050. At first glance, this sounds extremely promising. A major oil company was going to rid themselves of fossil fuels. For those who remembered BP's greenwashed Beyond Petroleum campaign in the early 2000s, however, this felt like deja vu. Much like 2 decades ago, BP's new green initiative seems to be green in words only. A look behind the oil company's new eco-drenched slogans and flashy green graphics reveals very little has changed in their business practices. First of all, their net zero claims only apply to direct emissions caused by drilling and processing oil and gas, and not from consumer-side emissions of their product like car exhaust. This means that BP could claim zero emissions by completely reducing their emissions from operations without even considering the polluting destruction of their gasoline or natural gas. But the thing is, BP isn't even reducing the emissions of their infrastructure and refineries. Under the label of net zero, BP can continue emitting as long as it offsets those emissions with massive tree planting operations that are often rife with complications, or some future carbon sequestration technology that is yet to be tested at scale. In theory, this means that BP can continue business as usual practices up until 2049, and then in the last year, try to suck up all the emissions it has created by planting trees and using currently unrealized carbon capture technologies. What's more likely, however, is that when 2049 hits, BP will just push the target further into the future, and in doing so, lull us further into inaction. To add insult to injury, BP's pledge excludes more than 40% of its oil production and 15% of its gas production. A report from Inside Climate News reveals that the BP pledge would only cut the emissions intensity of their products by less than 30%. But even here, BP is using wordplay to disguise inaction. Emissions intensity is not the same as emissions. French fossil fuel giant Total, for example, cut their emissions intensity by 6%, but its total emissions rose by 8%. And with a target 30 years in the future and very little enforcement protocols, BP can push the consequences of its climate destruction down the line, all while profiting off its green image. In short, net zero emissions doesn't mean zero emissions, and BP knows it. BP is an extreme example of how companies abuse the loopholes of the net zero framework. But in a capitalist global economy, profit and competition incentivizes this kind of greenwashing and political trickery. Under capitalism, it's easier to make more money claiming you're not polluting than actually not polluting. As we've just seen, most net zero climate targets fail to truly face the climate crisis head on. Instead of focusing on emissions reductions, which is a sure way of minimizing the amount of greenhouse gases in the air, net zero plans often rely on carbon capture and sequestration strategies, which either come in the form of natural offsetting through tree planting or technologies like direct air capture, which are currently impractical at scale. In the case of nature-based sequestration, most offsetting is doing more harm than good. In a ProPublica investigative piece, journalist Lisa Song writes, "If the world were graded on the historic reliability of carbon offsets, the result would be a solid F." She goes on to cite reports like a 2015 paper revealing that 75% of carbon offsets from one carbon trading scheme were unlikely to represent real reductions, and that if countries had cut pollution on site instead of relying on offsets, global carbon emissions would have been 600 million tons lower. In addition, natural sequestration in the form of tree planting and forest preservation are fueling new forms of green colonialism. Buying up and quote-unquote preserving huge tracts of land, often in the imperial periphery, corporations and countries push local residents off of forests or grasslands that they might have lived on for decades. But even if those nature-based carbon sequestration schemes were somehow effective, the sheer scale needed to make up for business-as-usual emissions is ecologically impossible. In its quest to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, Royal Dutch Shell plans to deploy more carbon offsets by 2030 than were available globally in 2019. And that's just for one company and won't even make up for all of Shell's emissions. So at the end of the day, net zero targets are greenwashing at best, and at worst, they work to lock in decades of inaction and give rise to colonial land grabs masquerading as carbon sequestration schemes. Given the inefficacy of net zero, how do we carve a path towards real zero emissions? Future goals must be focused on eliminating emissions. There's no two ways about it. Only ambitious emissions reduction schemes from the imperial core and multinational corporations can pull us back from the precipice of climate chaos. Real zero emissions targets force us to come to grips with destructive capitalist pursuits. This means keeping all fossil fuels in the ground. It also means building a 100% renewable world instead of fossil fuels, replacing industrial agriculture with agroecological permaculture, and embracing a simpler life instead of a consumerist one. But while we strive for a real zero world, we must reduce the harm of false net zero targets. That means pushing for transparent pathways, tangible milestones, or even, as one paper argues, separating targets for emissions reductions and negative emissions. Because at their core, net zero targets are a gamble. And if we're playing for the lives of billions of people, that gamble just isn't worth the risk.
Now we're going to hear from Terry Ahern, who's the CEO of the Scottish Environment Protection Agency.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I want to pick up on a couple of comments that have been made in the first part of the session. Lord Deben, you just talked about we don't have time. So we have very little time left to solve these problems. Jennifer, in your introduction, you talked about the collaboration is the key. So what does a regulator have to offer in this field? And I do actually want to use my 10 minutes to make an offer. So from the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, or SEPA, I have an offer to your sector, your profession, your field of endeavour. And it's based on turning around what a regulator is for. So when ministers or governments or parliaments create a regulator, they are creating a set of public officials who can interfere in people's lives. That's not something that politicians do very readily. They do it when there's a good reason and a need. And essentially the need is bad stuff's happening and you need someone to do something about it. So if you look back at the history of health and safety, it's a very blunt way to say it, but too many workers were being injured or killed, so you needed a health and safety regulator. The history of environment agencies or EPAs is, toxic pollution in rivers, terrible air quality, waste out of control, so you set up a regulator. If you take the point about we don't have much time left, so if we get to the end of this decade and we haven't made serious inroads into decarbonising, dematerialising our economies and societies, then time will be up. And quite seriously for our species, it'll be up. So a regulator needs no longer just to stop bad stuff. We need to do that. Here in Scotland, many of you will be aware we have issues such as the unnecessary flaring that happens at the ExxonMobil site at Mossmoran. That's an example of the traditional stuff places like SEPA were set up for, and we put a huge effort into that. We have to get them to stop doing that traditional sort of pollution impact. But that's not enough anymore. What we have to do is help businesses like that, and it sounds a bit strange in terms of business like that, decarbonise, dematerialise. We have to make the energy transition. And that means as a regulator, we have to shift from being satisfied with just achieving compliance outcomes. So in our One Planet Prosperity strategy, we are very clear we will get everyone to compliance. But if we get everyone to compliance, which is what a regulator tends to judge itself on, that will be nowhere near enough, because that won't get us anywhere near decarbonising and dematerialising, and not quickly enough. So I wrote a statement last night for something we're working on, and it went along the lines, something like this, that the goal of a set of regulators getting together on a project in Scotland, I can't remember the exact words, but it was something such as, at its worst, regulation doesn't even solve compliance problems. Like when regulation's operating badly, it doesn't solve compliance problems, and it certainly doesn't help with innovation and transformation. It usually gets in the way. At its very best, and this is what we need from regulators in this decade, we have to quickly solve compliance problems so compliance becomes yesterday's issues. For goodness sake, if we've got a decade to really make these big inroads, then we can't be spending it struggling to get people to compliance. We have to get people to compliance quickly. That becomes yesterday's issue. And what we focus on is not just not getting in the way of innovation, the sort of innovation that you're talking about at this conference. We become a very active driver, supporter, partner of it. So my offer is from SEPA that we will make that transition, and we are making it. And I just want to give a few examples. We have, what we tend to regulate is the sites. So if you take the whisky industry, it's our top performing industry in terms of compliance. Last ratings were 94%. We'll get them to that 100%. They're very determined about it. They've set a beyond compliance strategy for themselves. Their trade association, the Scotch Whisky Association, launched it a couple of weeks ago. It sets ambitious targets for reducing carbon, reducing waste, reducing water beyond what the law requires, and not just at its sites that we regulate, but through its supply chains. That sort of ambition is what SEPA is here to support. And if I give you a hypothetical example, it's not hypothetical, but it's commercial in confidence, so I can't reveal who it is. But what we tend to get is businesses coming to us now and saying, look, we think our waste stream could become the feedstock for an industry as part of the food and sector field in Scotland. We can just sit back and say, well, that would be good. But what we actually do is when we regulate sites in 34 sectors, we are effectively regulating supply chains and value chains to unlock a lot of the innovation, and including the sort of things you're talking about at this conference. One thing that has to happen is you have to be able to share risk and return through supply chains and value chains, because sometimes the costs of an innovation in a supply chain will fall largely to one set of businesses, and sometimes the revenue will fall to another set. Sometimes the risks are very split along the supply chain. We have the ability to work on that. So for example, barley growers, whiskey distillers up in the north of Scotland, certainly where the distillers are, suffer from droughts. As an Australian, I find it a bit strange to understand when I first came here that Scotland does have droughts, but we do. And that water shortage is a threat to the environment, but it's also a threat to the economics of those two sectors. While they're in the same supply chain, we regulate them both. In our new way of regulating, how do we help them work together to reduce water use in ways that means they can produce the quality of product, one as an input to the other, and then the whiskey industry as the product they then sell into the consumer market? How do we partner with them and help them in that supply chain arrangement unlock the sort of innovation that will tackle these really significant issues? The other example, and I just want to finish on this one, is our placemaking set of initiatives. So we have 6 placemaking trials. Placemaking is becoming a bit of a buzzword. Things tend to become buzzwords because they're meaningless cliches or because they actually mean something worthwhile, and I think placemaking does. And so in the leaving catchment, we have 14 partners signed up to one of our voluntary sustainable growth agreements, everyone from private businesses like Diageo through to the local council, Fife Council, Keep Scotland Beautiful, the Coal Authority. And what we have there, we started with our job was looking after water quality. What we really have is 15 partners working with the community on how do we decarbonise, dematerialise this part of Scotland. And when we launched that Sustainable Growth Agreement, I said on STV News that this was one of the heartlands of the original high carbon industrial revolution, which created so much of our prosperity. We didn't understand what the impact of that carbon would be back then. Wouldn't it be sensational if this could be one of the heartlands of the next low carbon industrial revolution? And that's the sort of thing we're working on with a whole group of partners over there. Now, when you have ideas from your sector, the offer is there from SEPA. Don't come and talk to us about, look, here's SEPA's standards that the standards that we administer on behalf of the Parliament. Here's SEPA's processes. Forget our processes, forget the law. Don't worry about that. We'll come back to the law if we need to. But come and say, we've got an idea. We've got an idea how to decarbonise. We've got an idea about how to dematerialise. And talk to us about, is there a role we can play with our various work in supply chains, with our various placemaking initiatives? Because I'm making an offer to you and you need to come and say, SEPA, you've made this offer. Well, we've got something that we want to partner with you on. The worst we can say is, we don't think we can help, or it's not for us at this time. But the offer's there, and we really need, I think, to take up what Jennifer said about collaboration needs to be the key, and collaboration in a new way for organisations such as mine. So I hope that's a useful contribution to the conference, and I look forward to the rest of the session.
I decided I wanted to dedicate a significant amount of my life to solving climate change. I was worried that global warming would end up destroying many of the natural environments that people had worked so hard to protect. I thought the technical solutions were pretty straightforward. Solar panels on every roof, electric car in the driveway, that the main obstacles were political. And so I helped to organize a coalition of the country's biggest labor unions and biggest environmental groups. Our proposal was for a $300 billion investment in renewables. And the idea was not only would we prevent climate change, but we would also create millions of new jobs in a very fast-growing high-tech sector. Our efforts really paid off in 2007, when then presidential candidate Barack Obama embraced our vision, and between 2009 and 2015, the US invested $150 billion in renewables and other kinds of clean tech. But right away, we started to encounter some problems. So first of all, the electricity from solar rooftops ends up costing about twice as much as the electricity from solar farms. And both solar farms and wind farms require covering a pretty significant amount of land with solar panels and wind turbines, and also building very big transmission lines to bring all that electricity from the countryside into the city. Both of those things were often very strongly resisted by local communities, as well as by conservation biologists who were concerned about the impacts on wild bird species and other animals. Now, there was a lot of other people working on technical solutions at the time. One of the big challenges, of course, is just the intermittency of solar and wind. They only generate electricity about 10 to 30% of the time during most of the year. But some of the solutions that were being proposed were to convert hydroelectric dams into gigantic batteries. The idea was that when the sun was shining and the wind was blowing, you would pump the water uphill, store it for later, and then when you needed electricity, run it over the turbines. In terms of wildlife, some of these problems just didn't seem like a significant concern. So when I learned that house cats kill billions of birds every year, it put into perspective the hundreds of thousands of birds rather that are killed by wind turbines. It basically seemed to me at the time that most, if not all, of the problems of scaling up solar and wind could be solved through more technological innovation. But as the years went by, these problems persisted and in many cases grew worse. So California is a state that's really committed to renewable energy, but we still haven't converted many of our hydroelectric dams into big batteries. Some of the problems are just geographic. It's just you have to have a very particular kind of formation to be able to do that. And even in those cases, it's quite expensive to make those conversions. Other challenges are just that there's other uses for water, like irrigation. And maybe this is the most significant problem, is just that in California, the water in our rivers and reservoirs is growing increasingly scarce and unreliable due to climate change. In terms of this issue of reliability, as a consequence of it, we've actually had to stop the electricity coming from the solar farms into the cities because there's just been too much of it at times. Or we've been starting to pay our neighboring states like Arizona to take that solar electricity. The alternative is to suffer from blowouts of the grid. And it turns out that when it comes to birds and cats, cats don't kill eagles. Eagles kill cats. What cats kill are the small, common sparrows and jays and robins, birds that are not endangered and not at risk of going extinct. What do kill eagles and other big birds like this kite, as well as owls and condors and other threatened and endangered species, are wind turbines. In fact, they're one of the most significant threats to those big bird species that we have. We just haven't been introducing the airspace with many other objects like we have wind turbines over the last several years. And in terms of solar, building a solar farm is a lot like building any other kind of farm. You have to clear the whole area of wildlife. So this is a picture of 1/3 of one of the biggest solar farms in California called Ivanpah. In order to build this, they had to clear the whole area of desert tortoises, literally pulling desert tortoises and their babies out of burrows, putting them on the back of pickup trucks and transporting them to captivity, where many of them ended up dying. And currently, the current estimates are that about 6,000 birds are killed every year, actually catching on fire above the solar farm and plunging to their deaths. Over time, it gradually struck me that there was really no amount of technological innovation that was going to make the sun shine more regularly or wind blow more reliably. In fact, you could make solar panels cheaper, you could make wind turbines bigger, but sunlight and wind are just really dilute fuels. And in order to produce significant amounts of electricity, you just have to cover a very large landmass with them. In other words, all of the major problems with renewables aren't technical, they're natural. Well, dealing with all of this unreliability and the big environmental impacts obviously comes at a pretty high economic cost. You know, we've been hearing a lot about how solar panels and wind turbines have come down in cost in recent years, but that cost has been significantly outweighed by just the challenges of integrating all of that unreliable power onto the grid. Just take, for instance, what's happened in California. At the period in which solar panels have come down in price very significantly, same with wind, we've seen our electricity prices go up 5 times more than the rest of the country. And it's not unique to us. You can see the same phenomenon happened in Germany, which is really the world's leader in solar, wind, and other renewable technologies. Their prices increased 50% during their big renewable energy push. Now, you might think, well, dealing with climate change is just going to require that we all pay more for energy. That's what I used to think. But consider the case of France. France actually gets twice as much of its electricity from clean, zero-emission sources than does Germany. And yet, France pays half as much, almost half as much for its electricity. How can that be? Well, you might have already anticipated the answer. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear power, about 75% in total. And nuclear just ends up being a lot more reliable, generating power 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for about 90% of the year. We see this phenomenon show up at a global level. So, for example, there's been a natural experiment over the last 40 years, even more than that, in terms of the deployment of nuclear and the deployment of solar. You can see that at a little bit higher cost, we got about half as much electricity from solar and wind than we did from nuclear. Well, what does all this mean for going forward? I think one of the most significant findings to date is this one. Had Germany spent $580 billion on nuclear instead of renewables, it would already be getting 100% of its electricity from clean energy sources and all of its transportation energy. Now, I think you might be wondering, and it's quite reasonable to ask, is nuclear power safe? And what do you do with the waste? Well, those are very reasonable questions. Turns out that there's been scientific studies on this going over 40 years. This is just the most recent study that was done by the prestigious British medical journal Lancet, finds that nuclear power is the safest. It's easy to understand why. According to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people die annually from air pollution, and nuclear plants don't emit that. As a result, the climate scientist James Hansen looked at it, and he calculated that nuclear power has already saved almost 2 million lives to date. It turns out that even wind energy is more deadly than nuclear. This is a photograph taken of 2 maintenance workers in the Netherlands shortly before one of them fell to his death to avoid the fire, and the other one was engulfed in flames. Now, what about environmental impact? Well, I think a really easy way to think about it is that uranium fuel, which is what we use to power nuclear plants, is just really energy dense. About the same amount of uranium as this Rubik's Cube can power all of the energy that you need in your entire life. As a consequence, you just don't need that much land in order to produce a significant amount of electricity. Here we can compare the solar farm I just described, Ivanpah, to California's last nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon. It takes 450 times more land to generate the same amount of electricity as it does from nuclear. You would need 17 more solar farms like Ivanpah in order to generate the same output as Diablo Canyon, and of course it would then be unreliable. Well, what about the mining and the waste and the material throughput? Well, this has been studied pretty closely as well, and it just turns out that solar panels require 17 times more materials than nuclear plants do, in the form of cement, glass, concrete, steel, and that includes all the fuel used for those nuclear plants. The consequence is that what comes out at the end, since it's material throughput, is just not a lot of waste from nuclear. All of the waste from the Swiss nuclear program fits into this room. Nuclear waste is actually the only waste from electricity production that's safely contained and internalized. Every other way of making electricity emits the waste into the natural environment, either as pollution or as material waste. We tend to think of solar panels as clean, but the truth is that there is no plan to deal with solar panels at the end of their 20 or 25-year life. A lot of experts are actually very concerned that solar panels are just going to be shipped to poor countries in Africa or Asia with the rest of our electronic waste stream to be disassembled, often exposing people to really high levels of toxic elements, including lead, cadmium, and chromium, elements that, because they're elements, their toxicity never declines over time. I think we have an intuitive sense that nuclear is a really powerful, strong energy source, and that sunlight is really dilute and diffuse and weak, which is why you have to spread solar collectors or wind collectors over such a large amount of land. Maybe that's why nobody was surprised when, in the recent science fiction remake of Blade Runner, the film opens in a very dark dystopian scene where California's deserts have been entirely paved with solar farms. All of which I think raises a really uncomfortable question. In the effort to try to save the climate, are we destroying the environment? Well, the interesting thing is that over the last several hundred years, human beings have actually been trying to move away from what you would consider matter-dense fuels towards energy-dense ones. And that means really from wood and dung towards coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. This is a phenomenon that's been going on for a long time. Poor countries around the world are in the process still of moving away from wood and dung as their primary energies. And for the most part, this is a positive thing. As you stop using wood as your major source of fuel, it allows the forests to grow back and the wildlife to return. As you stop burning wood in your home, you no longer need to breathe that toxic smoke. And as you go from coal to natural gas and uranium as your main sources of energy, it holds out the possibility of basically eliminating air pollution altogether. There's just this problem with nuclear. While it's been pretty popular to move from dirtier to cleaner energy sources, from energy diffuse to energy dense sources, nuclear is just really unpopular for a bunch of historical reasons. And as a consequence, in the past, and I think a lot of others have sort of said, well, in order to deal with climate change, we're just going to need all the different kinds of clean energy that we have. The problem is that just turns out not to be true. You remember I discussed France a little bit ago. France gets most of its electricity from nuclear. If France were to try to significantly scale up solar and wind, it would also have to significantly reduce how much electricity it gets from nuclear. That's because in order to handle the huge variability of solar and wind on the grid, they would need to burn more natural gas. Think of it this way, it's just really hard to ramp up and down a nuclear plant, whereas I think we're all pretty familiar with turning the natural gas up and down on our stove. A similar process works in managing the grid. Of course, it goes without saying that oil and gas companies understand this pretty well, which is why we've seen them invest millions of dollars in recent years in promoting solar and wind. This just raises, I think, another challenging question, which is that in places that are using a lot of nuclear, have grids that are mostly nuclear and hydro, going towards solar and wind and other renewables would actually increase carbon emissions. I think a better alternative is just to tell the truth.
Publicly proclaimed, in fact, with enthusiasm, that they are carrying out a campaign to try to convince the population that global warming is a liberal hoax. And it's succeeded, unfortunately. The latest polls I've seen show maybe a third of the population believes in anthropogenic global warming. The media contribute in their own way. So, for example, when the New York Times runs a front-page article on what meteorologists think about global warming, namely, they don't believe it. Meteorologists are pretty faces who read scripts telling you if it's going to rain tomorrow. What do they have to say any more than your barber? But that's presented as if it's a significant contribution to the discussion. The same when they, in pursuit of the fabled objectivity, present two sides. One side is 98% of scientists who know anything. The other side is Senator Inhofe and a couple of stragglers, and that's the two sides. And people are supposed to make a choice between them. They leave out a third side, which is the substantial number of climate scientists who believe that the consensus predictions are much too optimistic, including some of the leading scientists right here who've recently run what they call the most extensive modeling ever done that concludes that it's far worse than anticipated, and that their own results are an understatement because they don't take into account such things as effects of methane after permafrost disappears and so on. So that's the debate that people are presented with, and it's not surprising that the effort to manufacture consent to the belief that doesn't mean anything is pretty successful. But what's rather interesting about this, and tells you something about the nature of our society, is that those same CEOs and managers who are trying to convince the public that it's a liberal hoax know perfectly well that it's extremely dangerous. They have the same beliefs that you and I have. So they're caught in a kind of an institutional contradiction. As leaders of major corporations, they have an institutional role. That is to maximize short-term profit. And if they don't do that, they're out and someone else is in who does do it. So it's basically, institutionally speaking, it's not a choice. That's going to happen in the major institutions. So they may know that they're mortgaging the future of their grandchildren, and in fact, maybe everything they own will be destroyed, but they're caught in a trap of institutional structure. That's what happens in market systems.
The Earth's climate has never been stable. For thousands of years, it has always naturally evolved. This variation has mostly been imperceptible compared to human timelines, but current global warming is unique in its speed and in its magnitude. Year after year, we can feel its effects on our daily lives. An unprecedented acceleration in climate change has been underway since the end of the 20th century and will most probably continue at least until 2050. We know that the current significant increase in the Earth's temperature is a direct consequence of greenhouse gases generated by human activities such as industry, transport and agriculture. We can no longer do anything about the emissions of the past that triggered the climate disruption we are experiencing today. But by reducing our greenhouse gas emissions now, we can still positively influence the Earth's climate for the future. And indeed, this is the goal of the measures taken by the nations of the world following the Paris Agreement, which aims to mitigate the effects of climate change and stabilize the increase in global warming below 2 degrees instead of over 4 degrees if we don't act collectively today. In the meantime, based on current rates, the broad outlines of the climate scenario that awaits us for 2050 are already clear. Even though climate change is a global phenomenon, the impact it has will vary over different regions of the world. That's why climate researchers are currently developing targeted methods and models that can produce precise and localized projections for specific areas around the world. We can use this data to get an idea of how climate change in 2050 will have reshaped the living environment, landscape, and geography of Europe. And this will help us to better anticipate the adaptations that will become necessary. The warming in continental Europe is higher than the global average. This means, for example, that a typical summer of 2050 will be hot and even scorching for the inhabitants of the Mediterranean basin, because in summer, much stronger warming is expected in southern Europe than anywhere else in Europe, at around 1 degree higher than the global average. In southern regions, the decrease in rainfall and the increase in evaporation will accelerate the progressive drying out of the soil. On a positive note, the increase in surface solar radiation could provide a boost for solar energy production. Even though overall the Mediterranean climate will become drier, the region could also see some much heavier autumnal rainfall. All of Europe will be subject to longer and more exceptional heat waves, and episodes like the one in 2003 will become increasingly common by 2050. Andalusia, for example, may well experience more than 20 days above 40 degrees every summer. Even more northerly regions, such as Germany, could experience several days a year above 35 degrees. In winter, the effects of the warming will be most strongly felt in northeastern Europe. There'll be fewer days of frost on the plains, and the snow cover period will become shorter. The reduction in snow cover, together with the warming of the Arctic, will turn the northern part of Europe into a real global warming hotspot. Climate change occurs more rapidly in mountains than in the surrounding plains, and the warming will be felt the most at higher altitudes. Winter sports on mountains will have to be totally reinvented at altitudes under 1,500 meters, where the snow will be ever more rare. And what about rainfall? Well, we should expect more intense and almost more frequent periods of rainfall, increasing the flooding risk for some regions. And over the continent as a whole, rainfall levels will undergo some stark contrasts, with much more rain in winter in the north and much less rain in summer in the south. This will create a fluctuating transition zone between the southern and northern parts of Europe. The climate of our cities will also change, a change accentuated by the urban heat island phenomenon that produces city temperatures higher than those in the countryside. European metropolises will undergo a major climatic disruption during the coming century. Just imagine that in 2050, London's climate might be more like Barcelona's in the year 2000, or that Parisians might have the climate of current-day Istanbul. Such a major disruption of the European climate highlights the importance of our actions to bring down greenhouse gas emissions, as it's the coming decades that will have the strongest influence on future climate stabilization. So while we work towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions as a global community, Europeans, just like the inhabitants of other parts of the world, will also be locally adapting their ways of life to the changing climate. And the projections for 2050, drawn up by scientists, will be essential to help us find the right adaptation strategies for our societies and to build our future together.
So let's start out with the basic idea that there's this debate in this country over global warming. There's some people who call it a complete hoax, and there are some people who completely embrace it, so forth. Where do you stand in that spectrum?
Well, I at one time was very much embracing the whole concept that we had a real problem, we had to do something about it. Back in 1988, James Hansen actually was the impetus for that for me in his presentation before Congress. But as I learned more and more about the issue, I discovered that maybe it's not as bad as it's made out to be. Some of it is hype, but there's also some data that has not been explored, and there's been some investigations that need to be done that haven't been done. And so now I'm in the camp of, we have some global warming, no doubt about it, but it may not be as bad as we originally thought because there are other contributing factors.
What bothers you most about the arguments that there is serious global warming?
They want to change policy, they want to apply taxes, and these kinds of things may not be the actual solution for making a change to our society.
What are you saying, that they're biased essentially, or motivated by something else? What?
There's a term that was used to describe this. It's called noble cause corruption. And actually, I was a victim of that at one time, where you're so fervent in your belief that you have to do something. You're saving the planet, you're making a difference, you're making things better, that you're so focused on this goal of fixing it or changing that you kind of forget to look along the path to make sure that you haven't missed some things. I started looking into the idea that weather stations have been slowly encroached upon by urbanization and siting issues over the last century, meaning that our urbanization affected the temperature. And this was something that was very clear if you looked at the temperature records. But what wasn't clear is how it affected the trend of temperatures. And so that's been something that I've been investigating. Anyone who's ever stood next to a building in the summertime at night, a brick building that's been out in the summer sun, if you stand next to it at night, you can feel the heat radiating off of it. That's a heat sink effect. And over the last 100 years, our country, in fact the world, has changed. We've gone from having mostly a rural agrarian society to one that is more urban and city-based. And as a result, the infrastructure has increased. We've got more freeways, more airports, we've got more buildings, more streets, all these things. Those are all heat sinks. During the day, solar insolation hits these objects and these surfaces, and it stores heat in these objects. At night, it releases that heat. Now, if you are measuring temperature in a city that went from having maybe 10% of non-permeable surface to maybe 90% over 100 years, that's a heat sink effect, and that should show up in the record. The problem is that it's been such a slow, subtle change over the last 100 years. It's not easy to detect, and that's been the challenge, and that's what I've been working on.
Essentially, you're saying that the records they're using for documenting the temperature at any given time aren't exactly accurate?
I'm saying that the data might be biased by these influences to a percentage. Yes, we have some global warming. It's clear the temperature has gone up in the last 100 years. But what percentage of that is from carbon dioxide, and what percentage of that is from changes in the local and measurement environment?
I'm going to go back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. You say that there are people invested in promoting the concern about global warming. Is there a lot of money involved?
Well, global warming has become essentially a business in its own right. There are NGOs, there are organizations, there are whole divisions of universities that are set up to study this factor. And so there's lots of money involved. And so I think that there's a tendency to want to keep that going and not really look at what might be different.
Dr. Muller at the University of California at Berkeley had similar concerns, went back and looked at the data, took much more data than anybody else had, and concluded, well, maybe there were some problems, but basically the conclusions were right. There is global warming, and it comes from carbon dioxide, which is made by man. Do you buy that?
Unfortunately, he has not succeeded in terms of how science views, a successful inquiry. His papers have not passed peer review. They had some problems. Some of the problems I identified. Others have identified problems as well. For example, he goes much further back to about 1750 in terms of temperature. Well, from my own studies, I know that temperature really wasn't validated and homogenized, where everything was measured the same way, until the Weather Bureau came into being about in 1890. Prior to that, thermometers were hung in and exposed to the atmosphere in all kinds of different ways. Some were hung under the shade of trees, some were on the north side of houses, some were out in the open in the sun. And so the temperature fluctuations that we got from those readings prior to 1890 was quite broad. And I don't believe they provide a representative signal because the exposure is all wrong. And Dr. Muller did not take any of that into account.
His conclusion, though, is that basically global warming exists and that the scientists, no matter what the problems were pretty much right on.
I agree with him that global warming exists. However, the ability to attribute the percentage of global warming to CO2 versus other man-made influences is still an open question.
I want to ask you a little bit about attitudes toward this among the public. We talked to a public opinion specialist at Stanford who says there's been 80% belief in global warming and man-made global warming throughout this country for the last 15 years. Do you buy that?
Well, I've looked at a number of opinion polls. You'll find a lot of them on my blog that we've covered. And depending on how you ask the question, we'll sometimes give you a different answer. My view is that the view of global warming peaked about at the time that Al Gore came out with his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. But ever since then, other factors have kicked in, ClimateGate, for example, and it has become less of an issue. In fact, you hardly see politicians talking about it anymore or pushing it as an issue. What's been happening now is it's become a regulation issue. It's gotten away from the political arena and into the bureaucratic regulation arena. And so people, I believe, based on the polls I've seen, aren't quite as believing as they used to be, and I think the trend is downward.
What do you think is the upshot of your attitude toward this? Should the Congress, should the American public say, nothing's been proven yet, we should wait? Or should we go ahead with trying to solve what many people consider a really scary problem?
You mentioned a really scary problem, and I think that's part of the issues. Some people don't respond well to scare tactics, and there have been some scare tactics used by some of the proponents on the other side of the issue. And that's where the overselling of it comes in. But this is a slow problem, and it requires a slow solution, I believe. For example, Our infrastructure for electricity and so forth and highways didn't happen in 5 years or 10 years. It happened over a century. We can't just rip all that up or change it in the space of 5, 10, or 15 years because it'll be catastrophic to our economy. We need a slow change solution, one that is a solution that changes over time at about the same rate as climate change. More efficient technologies, new technologies, use of more nuclear, for example. There's a nuclear type of a reactor that's more safe called a liquid thorium reactor that China is jumping on right now. And we should be looking into things like that.
Has this issue, I know you think it's been oversold and scare tactics have been used. Do you think it's become too politicized?
Oh, it's definitely become too politicized. In fact, some of the scientists who are the leaders in the issue have become, for lack of a better word, political tools on the issue.
Do you consider yourself a skeptic on global warming?
I would call myself a pragmatic skeptic. Yes, we need to make some changes in our energy technology. More efficient technology is a good thing. For example, I have solar power on my home. You know, I have done energy reductions in my office and in my home to make things more efficient. So I think those are good things. Those are good messages that we should be embracing. But at the same time, I think that some of the issues have been oversold, and they've been oversold because they allow for more regulation to take place. And so the people that like more regulation use global warming as a tool and the means to an end. And so as a result, we might be getting more regulation and more taxes that really aren't rooted in science, but more in politics.